get your wife out of the picture. So
don't get me.
You're sitting behind him, so I'm trying to just get it. There we go. There we go.
All right.
Welcome to Elaine's.
Thank you, Jeff.
So I'm Jeffrey Higgins. Elaine's is a literary salon. It's my wife's restaurant with Alexandria cuisine, and we offer free space for authors. We celebrated all kinds of authors' books, #1 New York Times bestsellers, indie published, the works from children's authors all the way to crime writers across the gamut. So we're really excited to have you here today. Thomas A. Burns Jr. writes from the small town of Wendell, North Carolina, where he lives with his wife and son, 4 cats, and a Cardigan Welsh Corgi. His work includes the Natalie McMaster's Mysteries, a dark, sexy thriller series, the Sherlock Holmes and Dr. Watson series, pastiches in the style of Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, and The Legacy of the Unborn, a novel of Lovecraftian horror written as Silas K. Henderson, which is a sequel to Lovecraft's At the Mountains of Madness. Tom was born and grew up in New Jersey, attended Xavier High School in Manhattan, earned a BS degrees in zoology and microbiology at Michigan State University, and an MS in microbiology at North Carolina State University. As a kid, he started reading boys' mysteries such as The Hardy Boys, Ken Holt, and Rick Brandt, then graduated to the classics by authors such as Arthur Conan Doyle, Dorothy Sayers, John Dixon Carr, Earl Stanley, Gardner and Rex Stout, to name a few. He has written fiction as a hobby all his life, beginning with The Man from U.N.C.L.E. stories and marble-backed copybooks in grade school. Tom built a career as a technical science and medical writer and editor for nearly 30 years in industry and government. He's currently a full-time novelist. His home story, The Camberwell Poisoner, appeared in the March to June issue of The Strand magazine in 2021, and many of his other home stories have been published by MX Books and Bellinger Books. The 6th book in the Natalie McMaster's Mysteries, Killers, was released in September 2021 and won the Silver Falchion Award for Best Action Adventure Book of 2021 at the Killer National International Writers Conference. The 7th Natalie McMaster's Mystery, Sister, was published on December 5th, 2022, and was chosen as a finalist for the Silver Falchion Award in 2023. Tom's Sherlock Holmes books include 10 Steps from Baker Street, released on March 1st, 2023, and A Peek into Watson's Dispatch, released on May 24th, 2024. So, John, welcome. It's great to have you here.
Yeah, thank you so much for doing this, Jeffrey. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, it's my pleasure.
I appreciate it.
Honestly, my guilty pleasure is talking to authors about writing. It's one of the things if I'm not writing, the thing I enjoy next most, other than being with my wife, is talking to writers about this. So, you're the 2nd or 3rd Sherlock Holmes author that we've had in here. What was it about Sherlock Holmes when you were a kid? Because you mentioned the Hardy Boys and some of these great, children's books that I think a lot of us, myself included, got hooked on. What was it about Sherlock Holmes as a child that hooked you in?
A snake. Probably one of his most famous stories, Doyle's, is The Adventure of Speckled Ben, where Holmes goes to a country house complete with a crazed scientist who has a cheetah and a baboon running loose. And he's systematically murdering his stepdaughters for the money. And he's using a snake to do the deed. And there was just something about that story that broke me in. And then, of course, there are more of these. And so I went looking for the rest of them. And I remember having to read them with a dictionary because Doyle didn't spare the language. But yeah, I read all of them, and there are 62. And after that is, well, now what am I going to do next? And that led into the great English authors like Dorothy Sayers and her Lord Peter Wimsey. And, it just went from there.
How old were you when you read these Sherlock Holmes books?
So 10, something like that.
And that launched you into adult fiction, basically.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Writing and reading when I was a kid, and then writing has always been a passion. But, there have always been those 2 words when I talked about doing it as a career, and those two words are you'll starve. So, you know, I went for other things, and I love science too, I really did. So, finally found a way to take science and turn it into writing, which was to become a technical writer. And that, I didn't start, so, but, when I retired from the technical writing, I really wanted to write fiction, because that's what I wanted to do all my life. And so I was so happy to get a series going. Now I've got this series going, and, you know, little by little, people are getting to know who I am, and my books are starting to move, and that's gratifying.
I mean, technical writing can't be any more different, right? Like how does it, you tell me, what is the difference between that type of writing and writing pure fiction that's coming out of your head?
Oh, it's totally different, because when you're a technical writer, you're creating a product. You know, you're writing a manual, for instance, on you know, how to use a certain piece of equipment. Or when I was working for Bayer, I used to do product documentation, which told the technicians who were making the products in the plant how to do it step by step. So it's very exacting. But see, that was good for the fiction, because especially with these Holmes books, I write them as historical mysteries. And you know, the details are right. If I tell you that there was a pub on the corner of these two streets in London in 1895, you can bet it was there. And I might even be able to tell you what it looked like inside, because there's a wealth of documentation about this age online, and that's very similar to technical writing. I mean, that's what you did, is you know, look for sources, interviewed experts, look for other documentation to bring accuracy into what you were writing. And I do the same thing with everything. Natalie McMaster's, you know, I sweat the details.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it is such just completely different writing. Let me just get back to the like when you were a kid and this feeling you talk about, like, you know, the historical novels, and was it the setting that also drew you into these things, or do you remember what it was that really pulled you
Yeah. Other things that I liked when I was a kid, Tarzan of the Apes. The setting was Africa. Edgar Rice Burroughs was scrupulous about describing those places in Africa. There's another series called Doc Savage, which was written in the pulps. Lester Dent wrote a novel every month for 30 years. And he felt a great responsibility because he knew that young boys read his books. So he did not want to be giving those kids bad information. And he took you to Arabia, he took you to South America, he took you to the Arctic, everywhere, and every detail was painstakingly researched to be correct. And I'm reading all this stuff, and you know, I'm learning all of these things I don't know that I'm learning. And you know, people will ask me, because I've got what I call a trash mind, where I know, you know, a lot about a lot of things. Where did you get that? Reading all this stuff for all those years.
So part of it, you know, learning, growing yourself, but also part of it probably escapism, because you're talking about foreign countries and
Oh, yeah.
things as a kid, right? A way to get out of where you are.
Yeah, to a certain degree, I always wanted to, you know, well, every boy, you know, you want to be a superhero. So how do you do that? Read about one.
So now that you're like a professional writer, what I mean, the idea of the pulp writers doing a book a month, and some of them did more than that. Some of them did multiple per month, but not necessarily that were research intensive, you know? So like, I just can't even imagine that, when having to research new locations and countries and cultures and still churn out a book every 30
Yeah,
days.
and they did it without the internet, which is, you know, for me, it's not that bad because, you know, I'm writing on a computer and a question occurs and boom, 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 answer is there. They didn't have that. So they probably had to do it the hard way, which was read, you know, documentation on the area that they were going to set their next story. But the other thing about these guys, and it includes Conan Doyle, they were storytellers. And that's the other thing that I think I learned from reading these people is how to tell a good story. You know, a story that will keep you on the edge of your seat, a story that won't let you put that book down. And when I get reviews of my books and, you know, damn you, Thomas Burns, I didn't get any sleep that night. You know, that's gratifying because that's what I learned from these guys.
That, you know, that is a great lesson because a lot of times it has to be the high concept or something. The story itself has to be interesting, right? And have twists, but it's that drawing the reader in from page to page. And I think sometimes authors miss that.
And actually, I don't know that the story has to be interesting. I think that the character has to be. You know, if the character is interesting, when you look at the home stories again, a lot of them, you know, now you read detective stories, it's murder, 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 breaking into Fort Knox, you know, all of the high concept stuff. Doyle wasn't like that. It was, you know, in some cases, petty crime. But what interested Holmes was the process, you know, how he could use his intellect to figure out what had happened. And he would just as soon go after a petty thief as he would go after a murderer because it was figuring it out. And, you know, that's why there are some murders in those books. They're not all like that. I've got a story in Dispatch Box at the end where he runs across a cryptogram in the agony column in the London Times. And he's bored and he's sitting out on the Sussex Downs and, you know, lamenting his fate. And he sees this cryptogram. Oh, what the heck, you know? And he starts working on it. And it's not an easy solve. And well, now what do I do? Now what do I do? And I go through the process of how he broke that code. And I don't want to give the whole story away, but, you know, he finds that it's more than he thought it was. He thought it was a couple of people trying to schedule an affair where their spouses wouldn't know what it would be. It wasn't at all.
You know, I mentioned in what draws like readers to characters like Sherlock Holmes, and you mentioned being a kid and the escapism of wanting to be a superhero. Do you think it's the super intellect? Is it someone that people could look up to? What is it that drives that?
If I knew that for a fact, I would be a New York Times bestselling author. I think it's predictability. When you're watching a sitcom and you see the character that you know so well, you see the situation before it happens. So what do? Oh my God, this is gonna be good. Because you know how this guy is gonna react when the situation comes, and you want to see that. You know, Holmes is like that. Once you read a few of the stories, you know him. You know what he's gonna do. And you anticipate. And it's fun to watch him do his thing. And I think that's what draws the people.
So it's the cleverness of the character, but it's also the comfort that the reader experiences in a known character, someone that they know what to expect.
They know what to expect. Another great detective was Nero Wolfe, written by Rex Stout. Wolfe, he's not Holmes, but again, he's very eccentric. He has his rituals. He has a certain way of behaving. And when you read those stories, you know what he's going to do. And it's fun to watch him do it. And then a good author always puts in a little twist where, well, it wasn't quite what you thought it was, but you have to do it in such a way that the reader will go, yes, that is what he would do. But I really think it's the depth of character. And I think if you've got good characters that people like to read about, you could talk about somebody, you know, stealing an ice cream cone from a little kid and turn it into a good story and people would want it.
Who was a writer? Some writer described the twist as like unexpected but inevitable. So once it's a total surprise, but then they have to go back and be able to see that all the clues were there and they
Yep.
should have been able to figure it out.
Yep.
How hard is that for you to come up with twists?
I'm a pantser. We were talking about that before we came on the interview. And that means that I write by the seat of my pants, and I don't often know what I'm going to write until I get there. And so it just comes to me organically. And, if I find myself being trite, then I'll stop and say, the trite thing is what the reader is going to expect. Now, what am I going to do that's not that? And, sometimes, I'll ask my wife, what do you think is a good idea? To me, it doesn't matter where the ideas come from. They're out there. You just have to find them. Or it may be something I read 30 years ago. Oh, I can do something like that. Whatever. I just have to make it fit in what I'm doing at the time. And sometimes I'll, write a bunch of stuff and that's not good and rip it back out, and come up with something else until it works.
I've asked every author I've had in here, I think, where they think story comes from, and you mentioned the ideas are out there, and I've heard so many interesting answers because it's obviously your subconscious works on this stuff when you're asleep, when you're not thinking about it, and like I believe every possibility exists out there, right? It's about choices and letting the story come to you. Where do you think story comes from? And it's not as simplistic a question as it sounds.
No, I really think it's right brain, left brain, and I never get those right. So I get left. But if I try to plot, you say you are a plotter, you outline. If I sit down with a piece of paper and I try to write an outline, I'm going to look at that piece of paper for days. I can't do it. But if I start writing a story, it just comes. And I really think that that's two different ways of thinking. It's the creativity of writing the story that inspires the plot, and it's the knowledge of what the character is and is like that inspires the plot. Because if I know my character very well, or Sherlock, who Doyle put out there in explicit detail, what would he do? And it comes because I know him, and I know what he wouldn't do either. So, it is a back and forth, but it's creativity. Whereas if I'm just looking at the outline and I'm trying to, and this, and this, and this, that doesn't work for me.
I mean, speaking as an outliner, a lot of it's the same. It's just envisioning it without actually writing the characters, thinking about the character, thinking about what they would do in given circumstances, thinking about possibilities. But even as a pretty big outliner, it changes significantly as I go because things just change, right? When you're actually writing the prose. So let's talk a little bit more about Sherlock Holmes. So how much importance do you put on staying true to this iconic character?
A lot. It is a pet peeve that, people want to make money actually by, having Holmes do things that Holmes wouldn't do. Cumberbatch is Holmes. I'm a high functioning sociopath. I don't think so. Holmes was not a sociopath. Holmes was a Victorian gentleman who, he had his Baker Street irregulars, the street boys who used to help him in his investigation, which was helpful to him. But he was also providing food and shelter and, things like that to poor families, there was really a dearth of that kind of thing in London. Robert Downey's Holmes is a libertine. He was not a libertine. He didn't hate women, but he definitely had the Victorian bias against women, and that men were logical and women were emotional and all of that. but he didn't go around picking up prostitutes. The TV show Elementary, that Holmes, uh, Watson, who was a woman in that series, would come home and find Holmes in there, half naked with a couple of women he picked up off the street. It's not Sherlock Holmes. If you want to do that, just name your character something different. But wait, if I do that, then nobody will buy the book or watch the TV show because they're expecting to see Sherlock Holmes. And, it gets me mad when I see that stuff. So I wanted to write Holmes as Holmes. And if I do that, these are the best-selling books I have. And, in a way, I hate it because I want my Natalie McMaster books to be the best-selling books I have, because I did that. Conan Doyle did this. But those books still resonate after 150 years. Why is that? It's because Holmes is Holmes and Watson is Watson. And people love those characters.
I mean, I agree with you on being true to a kind of character, but is that out of like a sense of like, is it an ethical decision based on a previous author's work, or is it because you feel a responsibility to the readers, or all of the above?
Both, yeah. And there are tons of Sherlock Holmes societies around the world. A lot of the people in the societies feel like I do, where you need to stay true to Holmes. That's why we're having a Sherlock Holmes society and not a somebody else society. He's who we're celebrating. Let's celebrate him. And
so writing series is in anybody's series, and we have a lot of legacy series now, right? From everybody from Flynn to Clancy to, and so there's this built-in audience. And Sherlock Holmes has been around so long, though. How much harder is it to write to an audience that knows him inside and out, has been reading them about him since they were children?
I don't know that it's hard because I've been reading him since I was a kid. There's a wealth of detail out on the internet for things that I don't know, to make it easy for me to find out. All of the Holmes stories are on the internet, so I can, go back and look if I don't remember. But, when I was reading Holmes as a young person, I read the stories over and over and over. So I know Holmes probably as well as anybody. That means it's just not that hard for me to write as Doyle because I just know the character. I would imagine it would be terribly hard for somebody who's only read one or two stories.
Is that one of the reasons why you decided as an adult then to go back and write Sherlock Holmes?
Oh, I love Sherlock. And actually the reason I decided was because there was a gentleman, and I'll call his name, David Markham, who is constantly recruiting writers for these MX to help the school. And I saw one of his posts, submit a story for the book, and I know what the heck, So I wrote a story called The West End Horror. Not The West End Horror, that's Nicholas Myers. The Horror on King Street. And that's in my first book. And I sent it to David, and he was like, wow, why don't I know who you are? And, I didn't think I'd done anything extraordinary, but he did. And it got published in the MX books. And, please send me more. So I had written probably, I don't know, half a dozen stories or more for the MX books. And then I wrote one called The Camberwell Poisoner, which is what's known as in home circles an untold tale. And that means that it was mentioned in Doyle stories, but Doyle never wrote the story. And that story was rejected for the MX books. So I said, fine, what do you do when you get rejected? You find another market. So I sent it to the Strand magazine, which is one of the premier mystery magazines in the country, and it has a home story every month, and they bought it. So, wow, and I had two other New York Times bestselling authors on the masthead with little old me in that issue. So, I was kind of flabbergasted, and at that point, I'm like, well, I need to put this stuff into a book. And most of the stories in the first book were published either in the MX books. That's the other nice thing that Steve Evans does. Since he doesn't pay you for the stories, you have the copyright. And all he asks is that you let it come out in his book first before you reuse it. But once it's come out, then I put it in my own book. And the other publisher I work with is Belanger Books, and Derek Belanger, and he does pay for his stories, and he asks that you wait a year and before you put it out in another venue, and I have done that. So, but I mean, I think these guys are great because they're the ones who got me doing this.
See, we published a lot at this point. Do you remember that feeling the first time when you saw your first work in print? What did that feel like?
Well, we'll have to go back to Natalie McMaster's because for the first year, I tried to go the traditional publishing route. And I wrote the queries, and if you don't hear from us in 8 weeks, it's no. And, that gets old fast. And I was 65 at the time. And I decided to give it a year. And then once I gave it a year, it's okay. We're going to Amazon, we're going to Kindle, and I'm going to do this myself. Well, no traditional publisher will touch you. Well, they haven't touched me in a year, so what do I got to lose? And, I don't want to be dead when my first book comes out. So I wrote Stripper, is the name of the book. And I shudder when I think of the cover I put on then. Because I do everything myself. I do the covers myself. I do the blurbs myself, all of it. And, but, I held it in my hand and then it started selling. And, that is so gratifying that, people think I can entertain people with my work. As a side, my wife and I ran an antiques business for a long time. We went out to the shows. And, with that, what you do is you go around and you find things, you buy low, you sell high. But I used to get a great deal of satisfaction when somebody bought one of my pieces because they liked something that I like, and it's a validation. And it's the same thing with my books. I obviously like these stories. I put a lot of heart into them. So when somebody buys one, it's not about the money. It's about they like what I did. And then if they will write me a review, and it's a good review, it's even more validation. And I've gotten really few bad reviews. I've gotten a few, everybody does. But most of them are pretty good. So it's really now for me a matter of getting people to know who I am, which is what I'm doing here today.
That's hard. I mean, that is the whole game. It's about discoverability and breaking out of the millions of books that come out every year. And now, for sure, you're competing with like Netflix and all the other avenues that people have for on-demand entertainment. So even just as a book, just getting them to read any book. But most of the books that go through even the big five aren't earning out. So it's only a handful of those, a very small percentage that actually break out.
Yeah, I'm afraid reading is maybe dying. I don't have anything to back that up. It would be a shame because, and don't get me wrong, I like Netflix and movies and all that stuff as much as anyone, but you don't have the depth that you have with a book.
Yeah, I mean, in a book, the story's in the reader's mind, right? So they're a participant, they're creating. It's a unique story to them. No one's going to see it the exact same way they do.
But it's also the depth. When you're describing the settings, or when I'm taking you to Arabia, to Africa, to the Arctic, you can't put that, or it's really hard to put that in a TV show. To where, and you're right, I think it gets into the reader's head so you feel it. And one of the most complimentary things a person can say to me, and I've heard it a few times, was you put me there. I felt like I was with homes in London. That's what I'm trying to do. I want you to see it, smell it, feel it.
No, it's fantastic. How do you mentioned that readers are coming for the character for homes. How do you make it relevant? Because I mean, what's culture has changed, norms have changed, things
Right.
you can say and do have changed, things that were acceptable 30 years ago might be off-putting to people today. So when you're writing about something that happened in another century, how do you make it work for today?
Well, and don't get this wrong, but I don't care if it's off-putting because that's your problem. My problem. That's the wonderful thing about being an independent author. But that said, I don't try to change the mores of a certain age. However, I do want to make it relevant, especially in Dispatch Box. I try to highlight some facet of Victorian London in each story. One of the stories has to do with a workhouse. And a workhouse is where you went if you were indigent, you couldn't earn a living. So you went to the workhouse, they gave you a bed, they made you work at some terrible jobs and fed you lousy food. Took your clothes away and gave you a uniform. And if you left the workhouse in a uniform, they'd throw you in jail for stealing from the government, because the Victorians had this idea that if you were poor, you deserved something you'd done. I try to highlight that for the modern reader. This is what it was like. And I'm not condemning it per se. I mean, I think it's terrible, but I want you to see it. Then make up your mind, what should we do to help the poor? Should we have the workhouse? Is that what you want? And I try to do each story like that, where I'm just showing you what it was like in the age. And let you do the comparisons to the modern age, and in a lot of ways see how far we've come. And also, Holmes was a progressive in his way. He didn't like a lot of the things that went on in his society, but he was a realist. So he knew what he could do and what he couldn't do. He could have his Baker Street irregulars and give them a shilling when they did something good for him and feed them for a couple of weeks. But he wasn't trying to save the world. He was trying to solve his cases. And if he did some good in the process, he was happy. So, that's what I'm trying to do too. If I do some good in the process of entertaining you with these stories, I'm happy.
To what extent do you think it's easier for people to look at issues of, say, welfare or mandatory work when it's done through fiction, and especially when it's done in another time period?
Oh,
I
yeah.
think they're more open to looking at the ideas kind of from afar.
I will mention a name that many people will vilify, but Ayn Rand. That was what she did. Because, she had her way of thinking, her philosophy, which she thought was true and good and right. But she also understood that if you preach politics or philosophy or anything to people, it doesn't take very long for them to. But if you tell a story with a good character who's relatable and believable, and the outcomes of the story show what you believe that the outcomes of the philosophy is, that a lot more people are going to be persuaded that at least some aspects of what you are trying to inculcate in them are truly correct. Because they're not being preached to. And I think you said it's in their mind. They're the ones who are making the conclusions. I'm not presenting them with a conclusion. I'm just showing you the facts. Now you decide, and I'm sure there's some people out there who might want to read my book and want to go out and start building workhouses. Oh, well. But I think most people, when they see that, your first reaction is probably, no, it wasn't like that, was it? Yeah, it was. It sure was. And you can find all of the documentation online, contemporary descriptions of what it was like to live like that. I wrote another story called the Appleton Tragedy, which involves a woman from South Carolina who brought her slave to London after the Civil War, because she found living in South Carolina after the war was over kind of untenable, and she has that secessionist mentality, and she is not shy about speaking it. And that's the story I've taken a little bit of flack for. But again, these people were around. And I'm showing you something. Not if you read my books, and when you're all done, you think you know what my politics are, and you think you know what my beliefs are, you're wrong. Because I won't do that. But I will show you what was going on at the time, and again, let you make your decision.
I think that's smart too, like keeping, you can talk about politics, but keeping your politics out of it and giving the other side or both sides, a fair shake so that you're at least representing what they're saying properly.
Well, but the other side of the coin is too that people, if you write it, you must believe it. And the Natalie McMaster's books have a very strong LGBTQ theme. And, again, there's both sides in there. The characters in the book are lesbians and bi, but they take a lot of the flack for that. And, every once in a while I will get a comment, that I'm a homophobe. No, I'm not. But there are people who are, and if they're in my books, that's how they're going to act, because that's what they are.
Isn't it funny how our readers always infer like something that an author believes based on what a fictional character is doing?
Yeah, exactly.
And I'll get a lot of the times, I know who that is, or oh, this is you, or like it's not. Of course, all your characters come out of your head, but it doesn't. You have to have a diverse group of characters with different thoughts and beliefs that you. If they were all just like you, it would be a pretty boring book, wouldn't it?
Yeah, and I mean, all I need to do is watch TV, watch the news, and I see these people. So all I do is write about them the way that they are. And no, because I write it doesn't mean I believe it. It just means that the character does. But I think people do sometimes have a problem separating character from author.
So I wanted to ask you about your research process a little bit, because I just wrote a historical novel with my agent that we're working on. And it's obviously very different. And I know you've been in this Sherlock Holmes world. This has been your universe for a while. But how much research do you have to do? Let's start there.
Again, since I'm a pantser, I write the story. And then, well, Holmes is going to the pub to get some information. What pub? Where is it? Map of London in 1895 comes up on the computer screen. Aha, there's a pub. What can I find out about that pub? Is that pub appropriate to my story? And it's very focused research based on the plot of the story. So I'm not spending, I try not to go, and sometimes I do, you go down the rabbit hole, because reading about the research is so interesting, at least to me. Then I'm, and my wife will get mad at me because, I bought a book about workhouses for about $25. Did I read the whole book? No. But I did get some stuff out of it that helped illuminate the story. And, I shouldn't be doing that, because I can get the same information from the internet. I'll work a little harder. But, I don't have a process where, okay, today we're doing research and tomorrow we're writing. It's all integrated. And again, I think the thing that makes that so easy to do is the internet, because, I'm on the computer the computer is the writing tool, the computer is the research tool. Does that make sense?
Yeah, do you ever use AI in your searches, like chat?
I've been using it a little bit, but it doesn't take you very long to find out that I don't think we have anything to worry about with AI taking over mankind for a while. It's wrong a lot of the time. You know, Google just gives you information. And you can actually use Google in an AI fashion by how you craft your searches, so you get more focused information. But, you know, a lot, and I can't give you an example off the top of my head, but I posed a question to ChatGPT and everything in the answer was wrong. Everything. Wrong people, wrong era, wrong. And that told me right there, no, I'm not going to use this for a while. Because it actually turns out to be more work. Because I have to vet everything I get back. And if I go on the Victorian sites on the web, that's already been vetted by the people who put it up there. And, you know, again, it's contemporary. And what's the old journalist rule? 2 sources, 3 sources. So if I'm really unsure, let's get more sources, see what they say. Oh, and I'll tell you another thing that I do love to use is the Victorian newspapers. They're all online. The Illustrated Police Gazette is a hoot. And, you know, I will come up with story ideas from there. I'll take a real case that was in the Police Gazette and say, okay, now what if Sherlock Holmes was involved? How would this, you know, would it change? And a lot of the cases in the Gazette are more, you know, Charlie Applerock beat up his wife and chased her down the street and, you know, was arrested and put into police court. Okay, great. Why was he chasing her down the street? Why was he beating her? How could Holmes get involved in this? So I've got a real event, but by the time I get done, it's a fictional story. But, you know, it's just a wonderful way to spur creativity based on the era.
It's a magical what if, right? When you're
Mhm.
reading the stuff. So when you're when you're writing about that, you're talking about real pubs, you're talking about this iconic character you have to be true to. Are you also using real people that existed at the time?
Yeah.
And to what extent do you feel because you're putting them into fictional situations? Is there some kind of ethical responsibility at some point to not portray them in certain ways, or what are your constraints when you're using?
Yeah, I mean, actually, obvious for sure. You don't want to portray a real person as other than they were. There's a story in Dispatch Box called The Picture of Oscar Wilde, where Oscar Wilde comes to Sherlock Holmes to find something that has been stolen from him. And the title of the story is not an accident, because Oscar Wilde wrote The Picture of Dorian Gray. So I read a biography of Wilde. I read a biography of James McNeill Whistler, the artist. And then I wrote the story true to the characters of both men based on what I had read in these biographies. Whistler was a jerk. Wilde was a plagiarist. The reason Whistler and Wilde, who used to be friends, became not friends anymore is because Wilde would listen to Whistler's talk and take all of his wonderful sayings and say them elsewhere without attributing them. And Mr. Whistler took exception to that because he was very egotistical. And one of those wonderful brouhahas that, you know, occur in the papers back in those days erupted. And, you know, I was able to make great fun out of that. But it is true to the characters of both men. I don't know that they did these things. The other thing I found out that was interesting, and Doyle was kind of, he didn't really say whether Holmes went to Oxford or he went to Cambridge. And a lot of times I'll follow other Holmesian authors and say Camford as Holmes's college. But based on Wilde's biography and Holmes's age, he and Wilde would have been at Oxford in the same college at the same time. So I use that in the story because he would know Wilde. And as the story opens, Wilde comes in, and I'm not giving much away because the title of the story is a picture of Oscar Wilde. But Wilde comes in a mask and a big trench coat, and he doesn't want Holmes to know who he is. But of course, he's got this very distinctive voice. It's like, oh yeah, it's you, But where was I going with this? I don't remember where I was going with that. Sorry, senior moment.
It's okay, I have those more and more frequently.
I know, get worse.
So let me ask you, so you wrote a sequel to a Lovecraft story,
Yes.
a very famous one. Do you feel the same pressures with that, being true to the character and the author?
Not so much, no. To the author, yes, because Lovecraft had a style. Although again, I use two styles in that book, and the characters are all mine. If you're not familiar with Mountains of Madness, real fast, it's about a university expedition to Antarctica that found evidence of an ancient civilization that came from outer space. And most of the people who came back, Lovecraft had a great thing about madness. So they came back mentally impaired in one way or another. I picked that up and took it to New York City in 1931. The protagonists, there were two. One was an aging doctor who was essentially a gynecologist who was, treating all of these old women and feeling like he was kind of worthless because it was the kind of practice where they came in every week, whether they were sick or not. And the other was this woman who was a young woman who worked for one of these scandal rag newspapers in New York, who was just trying to get the great stories so she could break out. And I alternated the chapters and put them together. But it was all based on what happened in Antarctica back in, 10 years earlier. And you don't know that until the story unfolds. And again, I don't think I'm giving too much away because I'm saying it's a sequel to Mountains of Madness. So, with the fun with Lovecraft, it's like peeling an onion. There's a little bit and then there's a little bit. No, it can't be that. It can't be, yeah. It goes that way. So.
But for the readers of Lovecraft, like I met an author who actually had his portrait tattooed on the author's arm. So you have people who are going to be huge fans. So do you have to be super careful when you're doing these kinds of works?
Lovecraft, not so much, I don't think, because it's a cosmic horror story. That's what Lovecraft wrote. So yeah, I wanted to emulate the style, and with the doctor, I did. With the young reporter, I did not. I used a style based on what you would see in a 1940s movie or a 1930s movie with the language and all of that. But at the end, I wanted you to feel like Lovecraft could have written a story. And with all of my work, I use a lot of dialect because I like it. And it's kind of frowned on now. More than it was back in the old days, but again, that's the joy of being an independent author. So I used a lot of dialect in Legacy, and if you look at my reviews on Amazon, a lot of the reviews say this could have been written by Lovecraft.
Wow, that's a great compliment.
Yeah, and I mean that's what I'm shooting for.
Do you find it hard to mimic another author's style?
No, I don't. And I think that's my gift. I can look at how it's written and I just hear it.
Have you ever considered co-writing with another author just because of that ability that you have?
I would be open to it.
I don't know that I could work with a co-writer. I think it would be hard for me, but I have some people that are really good at it. I'm always fascinated when I talk to teams and they're writing together what that process is like. But, I mean, I know a lot of authors who are writing with, I know a couple writing with James Patterson, writing with some best-selling authors. And sometimes that ability to be able to write with a common voice is rare, I think.
Yeah, I think if I saw the style and was able to read enough in it, that I can pretty much mimic it. And again, as a pantser, I rewrite a lot as I'm writing. So I don't do a first draft and a second draft and a third draft. I essentially do one draft, but that draft may have been rewritten 10 or 15 times in the process of producing it. I'll open up my doc and look at what I wrote yesterday. Well, I don't quite, and I'll just rework it. So, when I published Stripper, which was my first book in 2018, I published the first draft. And, people, you did what? But, it took me 6 months to write that book, and I mean 6 months every day.
But it's not really a first draft because you're editing as you go, right? Many iterations and working it.
And the other thing as a technical writer, if I went to my boss and said, hey, I need an editor to take a look at this, he would take a look at me and say, okay, now you're an editor, go back to your desk, because that's just how it's done. You edit your own work, and you sometimes you put it up for a couple of weeks, so it's a little fresher when you get back to it. I do love to have a proofreader, but I also have beta readers who are reading my drafts as they're being produced. And, I listen to the beta readers. Basically what I do is 2 or 3 people tell me the same thing about my book. I go back and take a second look. If it's just one person, I'll still consider it. But you probably experienced that too, where one person tells you one thing and the other will tell you the direct opposite.
I have a writing critique group, and I use beta readers separately, but the writing group has 18 writers in it, and you'll often get 2 or 3 people saying, oh, this is the best thing, and 2 or 3 other people saying, you got to cut that.
Yeah, exactly.
So yeah, if a bunch of them have a problem with something, I know that it has to be fixed.
Yeah, exactly.
So do you write to a page count or a word count every day?
No, I don't.
Do you write every day?
I try to. And, my schedule is basically, if I can do it, I write in the morning, I read in the afternoon, and, I try to stick to my genre. I try to stick to the best-selling writers. What do they do? What makes these books bestsellers? And then in the evening, I watch TV with my lovely wife over there, so she feels like I'm not totally ignoring her. And that seems to work. And even, with television, it's much maligned. But, when I consider these guys who write these TV shows, they're sort of like the old pulp writers. They're trying to knock out 23 stories in a year. That's daunting. And I know it's done as a team. And we laugh about the cop shows where, the cop runs out and goes, hey, Charlie Applerotten. Applerotten looks over at him and takes off running. And then you've got a 2-minute chase scene, and it's in every bloody show. Why do they do that? Because the 2 minutes less that they have to write to get all these stories out in a year. Modular things, which we used to do as technical writing. You can write a modular scene and stick it into fiction books. And that's not plagiarism. That's not cheating because I wrote it. I just reused it. And if you read the 2 of them, after a while, you may get, maybe that is the same. But, it's a frame.
Have you considered being a hybrid author and going back with trying to go traditional with one of your books?
Well, the MX books I consider traditional, because he's a traditional publisher. Bellinger Books is traditional. He's a traditional publisher. The Strand magazine was certainly traditional. But no, I'm not gonna write queries and sit around and wait months for somebody to maybe kind of sort of get back to me. And the other thing is, especially in the McMaster books, they are challenging. They are not for everyone. I use certain words that people might not quite want to hear because Natalie has a potty mouth. And all of that stuff, I've heard one writer say, if you use the F word in one of your stories, you can just count on losing, a set percentage of your readers with one use of that word.
I put it in the first paragraph of my latest book that came out because if that's going to offend you, you don't want to keep going.
Yeah, well,
it's sort of a signal to the reader. This is what this book is, realism.
Yeah, that's kind of why I put a stripper on the cover of Stripper. If you don't like that, please don't do this. Go get something you like. But trying to get, agents want to sell books, agents want to make money, publishers want to make money. And there are a lot of traditionally published books I love. But again, you can look at them and see where there's sort of a code being observed. And, that's what I did when I was a technical writer. I don't want to do that. I want to write what I want to write. And, and if you don't like sex and violence and everything else, read my Sherlock Holmes, because they would be in a magazine in 1895 and all that stuff not in.
I think we lose something in publishing when we try to put all these guardrails on writing, where we're looking at things that fit formulas that have worked as opposed to new and unique writing. When something does break out that's new and unique, then everyone wants that, and that becomes part of a cookie cutter.
Right? That's right.
So I think the process itself is working. Well, so let me ask you, just wrap up here. What are you working on
now? I am working on, one of the characters in Natalie McMaster is a crusty old ex-Marine detective named of Amos Murphy. And he runs the 3M Detective Agency, and Natalie started out as sort of moonlighting for that agency. And I decided to go back to 1988 when Amos got out of the Marine Corps and started the agency. And why I did that, it's the same reason that Sue Grafton set her alphabet mysteries at that time, is because there's a lot of things that are not there. Cell phones are not there. Computers are not there in the way that they are now. DNA is not there. Other things, so I can do detective stories, not tech stories, not, I need to know who this guy is and where he is. So you sit down at the computer and 5 minutes later, you have all the information. No, Amos is going to do detective. And so I wanted to do some traditional detective stories, and we're going to see if this one flies.
That's fun. And where's the best place for readers to find you?
Amazon, definitely. I write under Thomas A. Burns Jr., except for Legacy of the Unborn, the Lovecraft story, which is Silas K. Henderson. I thought I needed a pseudonym for that just to differentiate it from the detective stories. But then I wrote Holmes under my own name. So.
It does help with when you have different audiences. Any questions? Let me bring the microphone to you.
What's your favorite book of everything you've written?
My favorite book of everything I've written is probably the last book in the Natalie McMaster series, which is called Shooters. The reason for that is that it's the plot line is pretty outrageous. I've gotten to where I like to tell 2 or 3 stories in one book and bring them all together at the end. And I do that in Shooters. And I just think it's got a lot of twists and turns in it. I like that. And, I just feel like that every time with that series, I come up with something to make it just a little better.
Second question, when do you really feel you've got it right? When you've written a passage, that's it.
Not to be flip, but when I know that's it. And I mean, it really is a feeling. It's not, there's no analysis to it. You just look at it and, yep, it sounds right, let's move on.
Any future plans beyond this series? Continuation of maybe the sci-fi?
The shooters ended on a huge cliffhanger, which is another one of my foibles. I'll end on cliffhangers. So I have to write a follow-up to that. I want to do more Holmes books just because I love writing Holmes books. Oh, I'll mention real fast. The first story in Dispatch is called The Wizard Goes a Mudlark. And the wizard is Sherlock Holmes, the Wizard of Montague Street, which is where he lived before Baker Street. And he met a bunch of street kids and did some magic tricks for them, prestidigitation. So they called him the Wizard. And I wrote 2 stories about the wizard in both of the Sherlock Holmes books. And I'm thinking seriously about doing a book of wizard stories because it would sort of combine Sherlock Holmes and the East Side Kids, if you know who they were.
All right, thank you.
All right, Tom, it's been a pleasure. Thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. And
Appreciate it. Your writing's fantastic. So I wish you best of luck. And if you're watching this video, go on Amazon and leave them a rating. It makes a huge difference for an author. Thank you so much.
thank you. And it doesn't even have to